To the Business Council of Australia now, and Jennifer Westacott. Thanks for joining us, Jennifer. Were you pleased to hear what the Prime Minister said last week?
Oh, absolutely, Chris. He was absolutely spot on. I mean, business is going about creating jobs, building the strength of communities. And look, you know, we live in a free society and we live in a democracy, but to see those violent protests, there's no place for violence and intimidation in our society. What I guess is the irony of this for me is that you've got these young kids who've been, you know, the beneficiaries of economic growth, protesting about one of our great industries that's delivered that growth and our higher living standards. And of course, forgetting about a young kid growing up in Townsville at the moment who can't get a job, who can't see a prospect, where that community is crying out for new investment. I guess the second irony is that, you know, what were they talking about at that conference? They were talking about how they reduce their emissions, how they protect the environment, how they continue to grow while achieving both those things. And this kind of idea that environmental protection and a strong and growing economy and an active business community can't work together, it's an absolute nonsense. So I think he's absolutely right. We were very supportive of his comments. Now, of course, we've got to sit down and do the kind of practical, sensible measures.
Well, there are a couple of aspects to this, Jennifer. One is when it comes to protesters, no matter how idiotic their claims or hypocritical, they've got every right to protest. If they overstep the mark with abuse or public nuisance, then there are laws in place to deal with them. So surely there's no law enforcement issue there or legislative issue there. They just need to, people and police and law enforcement authorities just need to implement the existing laws.
Absolutely. There's just no place in this society, in any society for that matter, for the sort of scenes we saw last week. People trying to get to a conference, people trying to go about their business, being stopped from doing it by being harassed. There's no place for that here. There's no place for intimidating companies in going about their normal course of what are they doing, creating a job for somebody. There's no place in that. Like, you know, this whole climate thing, we've got to get our focus back on what do we need to do. We've actually got to work together to get the transition to happen in our economy to a lower carbon future, to meet our Paris agreements, but to do so in a way that preserves affordability, in fact gets prices down and gets reliability up. And that is the job to be done, and that's what everyone needs to focus on. And unfortunately, these sorts of things, they distract the debate. And of course, you've got to ask, you know, notwithstanding it's okay to protest, is this going to get us to the policy we need?
Now, what about, though, this issue that Scott Morrison has quite rightly focused on, and that is where people, campaigners, activists, look to try and get commercial boycotts. They use email campaigns, social media campaigns to target a business. It might be Alan Jones because they don't like what he said, so they target their advertisers. They get onto customers, say, don't go with this business because they support something someone else has said. They'll go to another business and their customers and say, don't do business with this particular labour hire firm because they do work for the Adani coal mine. They're really trying to blackmail and intimidate businesses out of industries or ideas that they disagree with. Now, obviously, that's a problem.
I couldn't agree more.
But surely we don't need new laws to deal with it, though.
Well, I think we've got to look at examining, you know, and I think what we can do to minimise this. I mean, companies, of course, have choices about where they invest and choices about how they respond to these things, but it's very difficult when you're under this unrelenting intimidation by, you know, many activists. So I think the Prime Minister's right to say it is a form of secondary boycotts. I think he's right to say we need to do something about it because, you know, people have to remember what a business is, and this bewilders me, this, as you and I have talked about many times. You know, it's the 11 million Australians who work in one. It's the shareholders who own shares, many of whom are just mum and dad retirees. It's the customers who need services from them. It's the contractors who do business with them. It's your superannuation that depends on a strong business community. So I find it, I have to say, perplexing, this idea that somehow the interests of business are somehow not consistent with the interests of the community. They absolutely are. And business is entitled to go about doing its job of creating jobs, creating stronger communities without being intimidated.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, and I agree it's a problem. I just think new laws to look at this could be even worse than the problem. Maybe what needs to do here is business in particular needs to speak up more against these sorts of campaigns and offer support and solidarity for businesses, because in the end, for instance, you're a labour hire firm, or you supply accounting services, or supply food to certain companies. It's not your job to second guess their attitudes or what other business relationships they have. It's your job to run your business, employ people, and be a fair and efficient operator, surely.
Absolutely, and it's your job to get a good return for your shareholders.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, that actually is really important to do that. So, look, I just think it's about saying, what can we do to stop this? What can we do to give businesses the confidence, I guess, you know, to kind of take strong stands against this? Because it's a balancing act, isn't it? I mean, you know, the kind of relentless campaigns that some businesses are under. And yes, it's easy to say, well, they should just resist that. But gee, it's difficult, Chris, when you're just being hammered and when people turn up to your AGM and they disrupt it. I think, you know, it's one of those quid pro quo things where I think business would welcome some kind of rethinking of are there ways that we can minimise this?
Yeah, it is very difficult, and especially for smaller businesses. You look after bigger
Absolutely.
businesses,
Small business is just such a target here.
Well, they perhaps need a helpline. They perhaps, when they are targeted, need to go somewhere where they can get some advice as to how to deal with this, because quite frankly, half a dozen people on various Twitter and Facebook accounts can create an enormous amount of pain. And I was talking to a businessman recently too. Of course, you can't discount the fact that your commercial competitors might be anonymously jumping in on this or even creating this to try and do you harm.
Well, that's a very important point. We need to understand who's behind some of these campaigns, who's paying for it, who's funding them. But I agree with you completely. We need to think about small business, particularly mid-sized businesses who don't have, you know, all of the kind of people advising them that a big corporation would have. They are very vulnerable, and not just kind of a social media campaign just can't hurt your business, it can shut your business down. So I do think we need to kind of make sure that we get the balance right here, and that's why I think the Prime Minister's remarks were absolutely spot on. Yeah,
all right, we'll see the follow-through on there, but I think a lot of activity in the public space hitting back at this stuff and support for businesses when there are campaigns against them would be very useful. I just want to get your thoughts, Jennifer Westacott, too, on the news from Westpac today. Big drop in profits. Their executives say they're going to take a trimming or at least not get any bonuses. There'll be a lot of shareholders pretty disappointed, although the share market is still up today, so it hasn't shocked the Australian business world.
Look, I think it goes to, we've got to make sure we remember how important our banks are, because a lot of people, I think, or some people in the community would be saying, isn't that great? You know, our bank's profit is down. Well, it's not great. It's very bad. Because, you know, what we have to remember is that a shareholder today, a mum or dad retiree, a self-funded retiree, someone out one of our regional communities that was hoping for a bit extra income is not going to get that income. So my kind of concern, Chris, is that we make sure that we don't, you know, that the kind of people who hate business don't celebrate this, because this has a real flow-on effect into the community. You know, it makes credit for small businesses or for people who want to get their first home harder. You know, this is a very, very competent organisation. I'm sure that they've got the right strategy in place, but nobody, and this is my message, nobody should think this is good. And, you know, we need to make sure that, notwithstanding all of the issues in the Royal Commission, that we remember our banks have been the spine to a strong economy. They have been absolutely essential to it. They remain essential to it. And I think we've got to bring the era of bank bashing to an end.
Jennifer, just one other issue. There's been a lot of contention about Australia's Paris climate targets, whether we're going to meet them or not. A very detailed report from 2 Australian National University experts last month said that we are on track to meet the Paris targets without really any additional costs at the moment, that the hard work's really been done. This is important news. I want to get your thoughts on just how important that is, whether you agree with their research. Also, at what cost has this been delivered? You know, in terms of, you look at global comparisons, not a lot of countries are meeting their Paris targets. Surely Australia has paid a heavy price to do this.
Well, I think it's good if we're on track. We're going through that report and sort of looking at their assumptions. But I think it's really important that we make sure that we meet those Paris obligations and that we meet them in a way that puts prices down and reliability up, and that's the balancing act. And of course, that's the conversation that we have to have as a country. We have to make sure that we meet our international obligations, but that we're not putting people's power bills up, and that we're making sure that we've got a reliable system, the lights are on, that we can have all of the things that a kind of reliable energy grid gives us. And of course, we've got to make sure that we do everything to invest in new technologies, create new jobs. That's got to be the conversation rather than this, I don't know, this kind of quite extreme debate sometimes from either side, to be frank.
We've paid a high price already, haven't we?
Kind of action.
We have paid a high price already, haven't we, Jennifer?
Well, I think we've paid a price not for trying to reduce our emissions. I think we've paid a high price from many false starts and some very misguided policy attempts that have probably taken us in the wrong direction. What we need now is to say, okay, what is the objective here? The objective is to reduce our emissions in line with what we've committed to in Paris, and to do that in a way that puts pressure on prices to go down and keeps our reliability up.